there's going to be a war. And Bertie said, oh, how can that possibly be? You're a liberal. You can't be in charge of a war. It's a logical paradox. And Lord Grey said, not with me it isn't. And so it was. That by August, of course, of 1914, there was a war. Russell, privileged, intellectual, socially aware, but committed primarily to a life of the mind, was deeply surprised by it, alarmed, terrified by it, for two reasons. One was the outbreak of massive murderous violence on the continent, but the other side of it was the rise of a mass hysteria of an extraordinary kind. There are a number of books now, the last 20 years, that describe the hysterical excitement and pleasure of the masses when World War I broke out. Nothing bothered Russell more than A, hysteria, and B, the masses. Didn't like either thing. With the crowds, there was a biblical quote that his grandmother was very fond of and which he accepted. Thou shalt not follow a crowd to do evil. It's a quote from the Old Testament. So World War I was a catastrophe in both senses. Hysteria and crowds ruled the roost for the whole 5 years of the conflict. He began by thinking that he would act through the Union of Democratic Control, politically speaking, to do something about the war. That is, to force the government to come clean about the deals that it had made with France and Russia particularly before 1914, and which had now got them into such deep doo-doo in that year. He wanted an end to secret diplomacy. And at the same time, he wanted public politics so that people could argue about the war and maybe persuade people to go out and make peace right then and not wait till millions of people had died. Of course, he lost this battle. It became clear to him that by 1915 that politics and democracy would not do the job. And he moved into the organization we call the No Conscription Fellowship, became a radical pacifist, and found himself in the end, at the end of the war, in jail for 6 months because of his pacifist activities. This led him to a new set of views on world government, as you might expect. The causes of the war, in his view, were secret diplomacy, imperialism, and mercantilism, a kind of economy of the great empires that could do no good in his view. But deeper than that, not just the politics and the economics of it, was fear. His view was by 1918, actually by 1916, when he gave lectures called The Principles of Social Reconstruction. In this book, he comes pretty early to the conclusion that deeper than all of the other problems, imperialism, mercantilism, and so on, is a psychology of suspicion, fear. The view that people who live just across the channel are not just accidentally different from you, they are profoundly different. They hate you. And in return, we have every right to hate them and to take violent action against them if we wish. He developed a theory of impulse and instinct, which he thought accounted for much of what had gone wrong during the war in England. Impulses he described as creative and redemptive even in some ways, and those he described as destructive and possessive. His view was that if you identified them early enough, you could educate people from birth so that they would prefer the creative to the destructive, would learn to identify quickly those types of impulse that led to behaviors which were uncomfortable and consequentially bad, not just for yourself but for others, and therefore ought not to be done, and impulses that led to behaviors that resulted in cooperation, inquiry, thought, free language, and interrelations with other people. Now you see that Russell thought of early childhood education as absolutely central. When he came later to develop a complete theory of world government, his view was that you prepared for it in the bassinet. So that world government started in the crib. the last two phases of Bertie's life we've got to get to as a fan of world government and the reason for it. I think you can see how his experience of World War I might have led him to think of education and human nature and psychology the way he did. Now, as far as world government went after World War I, he was beginning to think in more and more radical terms. So one of the interesting things about this is, and this is interesting for world federalists to think about, he was absolutely skeptical about the League of Nations, as he would be skeptical later of the United Nations, which he thought to be pretty weak sisters. He was a purist. If it wasn't right, he just didn't bother with it, and he moved on and wrote his books, increasingly rabid in their extremist pacifist tone. In 1936, he wrote a book which recommended total pacifism and unilateral disarmament. World War II came, and this is phase 3 in his development of the idea of world government. World War II, for him, was the proof that organized, ideologically motivated world nation states, world ambitious, we would call them, ambitious for world domination. So Hitler in one case, Stalin in the other, were at the bottom of our troubles. And any world government that might come after the Second War was over would have to have enough teeth and enough legislative force that they could overcome not just the nation-state idea, but also the hysterical fondness of whole peoples for being led by mesmerizing, magnetic personalities at the top of the heap. All right, quickly to the end. The biggest of them all, some would say. I'm not going to say that. I think the biggest for him was World War I. But there are those who would say the biggest event in his life, and decisive for his views on world government in the end, was the invention of the bomb. And that's phase 4. Of course, you know that Russell ended up in jail for another week because he engaged in a sit-down strike and wouldn't move during the ban the bomb demos of the early 1960s. So he spent quite a bit of time in the 20th century in jail. In that final phase, he took the view that the urgency was now overwhelming and that it was time to jettison even the experiment of the United Nations and to move past it. I'm going to read you a little bit just to close off about this final phase, if I may. This is from pages 82-83 of Has Man a Future? There is one rather grave psychological obstacle to the establishment of a world government. It is that there would be no outside enemy to fear. Social cohesion, insofar as it is instinctive, is mainly promoted by a common danger or a common enmity. This is most obvious where a grown-up person is in charge of a number of unruly children. And of course, he's thinking back to Beacon Hill in 1926. So long as everything remains quiet, it is difficult to get the children to obey. But if anything frightening happens, such as a bad thunderstorm or a fierce dog, the children instantly seek the protection of the grown-up and become completely obedient. The same sort of thing applies to adults, though not quite so obviously. Patriotism is far more intense in time of war than at other times, and there is a readiness to obey even onerous governmental decrees, which is absent when there is secure peace. A world government, since it would have no external human enemies, because they would all be gathered under, would not be able to invoke quite this motive for loyalty. I think it would be necessary, as an essential part of education, to remind people of the dangers that would still remain, such as poverty and malnutrition and epidemics, and also to make them aware that if loyalty to the world government failed, scientific war, he means the bomb, would again become probable.